District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. We are 1 week away from a new administration taking afoot here in Washington, D.C. It's a very exciting time, I would say, for natural resources, energy, and conservation policy. We are going to get some sort of balance back in D.C., and hopefully that ricochets across the whole U.S. I will be closely monitoring the confirmation hearings of Doug Burgum for Interior Secretary, Chris Wright for Energy, and Lee Zeldin for EPA. I believe the two energy and interior picks are going to be before Energy and Natural Resources Senate Committee. Wright and Burgum are expected to go before ENR sometime this week, and I will try to have some analysis as it rolls out. I wanted to give a quick roundup of some cultural, geopolitical issues that do have some overlap with conservation. I'm namely talking about Greenland, the LA wildfires, and some of the root causes of that. And then also, of course, with Landman Season 1 concluding yesterday, of course, the LA Times climate correspondent that a lot of us have become familiar with bemoaned the show, accusing it of being a gusher of fossil fuel propaganda. So we're going to get through all of these three topics in this roundup ahead of the new administration coming in. I wrote a town hall last week concerning Greenland, kind of the nuance take into it. I'm not going to discuss the military implications or so much the geopolitical implications, but there is a natural resources and even wildlife hook to this story of Trump wanting to annex Greenland. The likelihood of this occurring, I would say, is very slim to none. It's very entertaining. I know a lot of people who are very excited about that prospect. However, Greenlanders, while they do want to become independent, do not want to be absorbed by us. Their populace is a bit more socialist than I think a lot of these people make out to be. And we already have some sort of agreement with Denmark in regards to protecting Greenland. That could be renegotiated from a military standpoint. Maybe there will be something relating to rare earth elements, which I'll go into shortly. Will the U.S. have more involvement in the Arctic? Absolutely, because of this question of natural resources. There's also a lot of oil and gas reserves, proven and unproven reserves. That's what I keep seeing. Although we have plenty of so-called liquid gold here in the United States, which we're going to harness more effectively, even with some of the last midnight order directives that Biden imposed on his way out from office. I think there will be some clearing by Congress and hopefully by the courts to rectify that so that the administrative state does not block offshore oil and gas opportunities in the future, because we critically need those to wean ourselves off of imports. So we don't need Greenland for oil and gas. But because China and Russia, China, which has a major footprint, they dominate production and processing of rare earth elements. Greenland is home to about 25 of 34 critical rare earth elements. I'm also a little bit cautious of going all in with rare earth elements because people are embracing it as a way to transition away from fossil fuels. We will not be doing that anytime soon. Rare earth elements are also integral to non-clean energy or non-so-called clean energy technologies. They're for computer chips and other derivatives. So it's even beyond solar and wind and EVs that rare earth elements are needed, lithium being one of them. There is debate over whether the trade-offs to harnessing these would actually be good for the environment, and that's a debate we're going to be having here in the States. But the rare earth element question is, I think, of very big importance, and I think Trump's play here, President-elect Trump's play here, is to ensure that Russia and China do not dominate in this space, not only for transport purposes, military purposes, but also for having a stake in these potential proven and unproven rare earth element deposits. Going back a little bit to the 1860s, stay with me here, but it's really interesting because William Seward, who was the Secretary of State of America, who helped to successfully carry out the transaction of the Alaska Territory purchase from Russia in 1867. I've talked about Seward's folly, which actually turned out to not be a folly. Alaska is a beautiful part of the United States. a nature wildlife wonderland, great for outdoor adventures. I loved my trip there. I want to go back again sometime soon. That turned out to be not a folly, of course. But interestingly enough, even though William Seward commissioned this report from his agency to execute the annexation of Greenland due to its multiple natural resources, bountiful wildlife, that transaction never proceeded. And now in the modern day, with Greenland having a say over their independence and governance, it's extremely impossible for, I would say, or more tenuous for absorption or annexation to occur. And like I said earlier, there are lots of complicated factors. I think Greenland actually wants to go under the European Union, despite having opposed that before. So if William Seward wasn't able to annex Greenland, I think it might be difficult for Trump. However, he will likely renegotiate this military agreement with Greenland, and maybe it'll encompass something about protection or overseeing of rare earth element extraction and development. Perhaps that is what it'll include because it is a national security concern, not just for energy and natural resources development, but now energy is being framed as a security issue as well. But I want to read from this report commissioned by William Seward and kind of highlights some of the really interesting wildlife that is in Greenland for you all to kind of appreciate. So this is a document you could read. I'm linking it to the show notes if you're curious. It's called A Report on the Resources of Iceland and Greenland. So not only Greenland was in consideration of annexation, but even Iceland too. And a lot of people travel to Iceland these days from the United States. But I want to read for you what this report observed about Greenland's bountiful natural resources, landscapes, and even, wildlife too, and marine life. So under the section, this is on page 17 of the report, the shores of Greenland, much more than those of any other country, are indented with deep bay inlets, estuaries, and fjords, some of them possibly extending from the western to the eastern coast, presenting an immense shoreline and furnishing most extensive and protected fishing grounds. These inlets are bordered by meadowlands, beech, and willow, whence the name Greenland. End quote. The population, neglected by Denmark, lives mainly by hunting, including furs and the fisheries. Greenland has in vast quantities whale, walrus, seal, shark, cod, ivory cod, salmon, salmon trout, and herring, foxes, wolf, reindeer, bear, hare, myriads of birds, including the king duck, eiger duck, dorskin, petrel, gull, brent, burgomaster, goose, kilowog, lorard, and sea swallow, etc. Good coal is found on the western coast at various points, extending far north, most cheaply mined, and close to the good harbors. From the best of these northern harbors of Greenland, there is believed to be practical summer steam navigation 1,500 miles to Alaska, extending also through Bering Straits to China or Japan, or southward to Sitka, Puget Sound, the Oregon River, San Francisco, etc. This Greenland and Alaska coal may possibly render this transit practicable and would be of immense value in connection with the fisheries. If you have the time, I highly recommend you check out this report. It's very fascinating, kind of gives a glimpse into why so many people are seeking out Greenland. Denmark does not want to get rid of it, but Denmark knows that it'll probably have to negotiate some sort of agreement with the US because we have been eyeing this area not only just recently, but within the last decade or so. And for energy security purposes, I think it is important and prudent for us to have some sort of play here, and that can be done without annexing Greenland. Let's move on to the California, Los Angeles in particular, wildfires. I've frequently dedicated episodes to forest management, mismanagement by California, shortcomings in water policy. We've investigated this even for my Conservation Nation video series. I've written at length about this. I'm from California, so this is personally important to me as someone who remembers growing up with wildfires. I still have a lot of friends and family, a couple family members in particular, who live within the vicinity of these wildfires. They're thankfully not in the center of where the wildfires have broken out, but they're pretty visible from the vantage point of where friends and family reside in Los Angeles. There's a lot of wildfire smoke. Lots of people I'm connected to virtually have had to evacuate. There's everyone from celebrities to non-celebrities who are adversely impacted and going to be displaced for a long time by these high-intensity wildfires. I believe there are 5 that are burning currently. California historically has been fire-prone. Los Angeles is a former desert that has been essentially created into this oasis. Water has been a very controversial issue. If you watch movies like Chinatown or even just read up on the politics of water, even why there's a refusal by environmentalists to permit the construction of either desalination plants or, even more importantly, water reservoirs, even though the voters of California have voted as recently as 2014 in a bond measure to construct more, with the expectation of their government constructing more reservoirs. That has not happened. California has the tools to manage their forests, to clean up chaparral, live fuels, brush, but somehow the state is still a tinderbox. This should not be happening in what is deemed the 5th largest economy or even 8th largest economy in the world. It's quite embarrassing that the leadership of California and Los Angeles County continues to default to climate change is what is underpinning these natural disasters. All of you are delusional or crazy to think that something else is causing this, and we're great managers. Don't believe what you hear, yada, yada, yada. But as I argued at Town Hall VIP today in my behind the paywall column, but I can read for you and kind of summarize my musings from it here. This goes back to California suffering from Garden of Eden syndrome. That's something that Mark Morano, a colleague of mine at CFACT who publishes Climate Depot, really encapsulated. I always talk about rewilding, which is the same thing as the Garden of Eden syndrome, returning nature to its pre-settlement state when humans did not live in the landscape. This goes back to and really encompasses the wildfire mismanagement, the water security issues, the lack of permitting reform, building permits. All of this is encompassed under this rewilding notion or this preservationist environmental thinking that says we have to restore nature to its original state, which is extremely impossible in a place as populated as Los Angeles. You will never return nature to its original state ever. Not in California, not across the wider United States, not in the wider world context either, global context as well. You can protect certain areas of nature that are deserving of protection. We have national parks for this reason. There are some wilderness areas that are justified. But to make all public lands permanently protected from multiple uses is what invites these really haphazard policies and results. Now, most of this is residential property, and you can take away the public land equation there, but a lot of these private homes are situated next to a lot of public land. There also has to be private land management of forests as well. California, sadly, for the most part, does not want to do this because they are strangled by this climate rewilding Garden of Eden syndrome. Environmentalists sue to stop forest management, cleanup of chaparral, reservoir construction because they think it's going to be an impediment to their rewilding agenda to restore nature to its original course. You just have to let the forest floors exist. Don't clean them up. Plant more sequoia trees. How dare you plant more sequoia trees after they nearly burned down in a 2021 fire in Sequoia and Kings National Parks. The glaring failures of the Los Angeles County water and fire managers is pretty evident, especially this water manager who makes, $750,000. They emptied out reservoirs in afflicted areas and they had empty fire hydrants. Anger by residents and those who are displaced by these fires is justified here because this county, notoriously mismanaged county, is mirroring that of the governor, Gavin Newsom, and his mismanagement, years of mismanagement even. It was only up until a few years ago that he started to allegedly take forest management seriously, but it's all done under the guise of fighting the so-called climate crisis. And I want to read for you briefly what his 2022 climate commitment argues and stipulates, and why I think this putting of climate policy ahead of conservation is why all of these problems have compounded across California, across Los Angeles County. They have a similar climate action plan that is rooted in equity, which is why that they haven't been attentive to the water hydrant issue, the fire mitigation issue, et cetera, et cetera. So when you put these extraneous factors ahead of fighting natural disasters, staving off environmental problems, this is what you get. You get manifold problems under so-called well-intentioned climate policies. These climate policies are not well-intentioned. These so-called well-intentioned policies are displacing a lot of people from their homes. There's going to be, $56 billion of possible damages, maybe even more, to rebuild homes if they're lucky enough to rebuild homes. And now Gavin Newsom and Los Angeles are like, oh, we're now going to allow for permitting and cutting red tape. You had to wait till a horrible disaster, perhaps the worst fire in California's history, to be determined. I'll include some links about the root causes of wildfires. It's mostly human-caused, according to the University of Montana. Across the most recent decade, 76% of fires were, unsurprisingly, started by people. What underpins high-intensity wildfire, scientifically speaking, it's not climate. Climate actually comes in third, if any. It's live fuels at 53%, weather at 23% rather, climate at 14% at best. Mismanagement invites a lot of these high-intensity wildfires. This should not be the case in 2025 in California, but this is what happens when the state managers, county managers are beholden to this rewilding climate agenda over conservation. Very lamentable, because I have many fond memories of Los Angeles. The destruction that is coming out through news segments is really heartbreaking, heart-wrenching to see. I feel extremely sympathetic with the people, the Angelinos back there, those that are personally afflicted. SoCal, we all, have a kinship, even if we're not from LA directly. We frequently travel there. It's what used to be a really great city. I actually much prefer LA over New York City if I had to choose between the two, because there's a lot of outdoor opportunities, great restaurants. You don't feel as suffocated like you do in New York City. It's a great outdoor playground, lots of fishing opportunities to do if you find them, great hiking across Los Angeles, and it's going to be huge setbacks for conservation, sadly, and that is my worry. But if you want to learn more about these issues, what is inviting this high-intensity wildfire, I will include some links in the show notes. Let's round out today's roundup with this very laughable column from Sammy Roth of the LA Times. I'm not trying to pick on Los Angeles. It just happens that this climate columnist, correspondent, writes for the LA Times. So the intention of criticizing Los Angeles is not intentional, but this is just what the outlet says. So he says essentially that Landman, which is a show I've talked about here, it's in the Taylor Sheridan Yellowstone universe. I like the program. I don't find it to be propaganda. I think it's actually more nuanced than just outright propaganda in favor of oil and gas. But Taylor Sheridan brings to life a lot of different stories and storylines of underappreciated or perhaps maligned industries, including ranching, hunting, fishing, now oil and gas, with this iteration of Landman, which was inspired by a podcast from a few years ago that was sponsored by the Texas Monthly called Boomtown. Great listen. So Mr. Roth calls in his latest column, Landman is a gusher of fossil fuel propaganda. Typical refrain that we always see from these type of writers. I just put out a Substack kind of contextualizing my initial thoughts into this, and I was actually able to refute some of the claims, rather misinformation, that Sammy Roth had put out, because he takes great issue with this show portraying and bashing solar and wind, lithium mining, and even offshore wind's threats on whales, which there is a causal relationship between offshore wind and whales, even though propagandists and alarmists like Sammy Roth have tried to use fact-checking and other means to suppress that information. And I've talked at length about why there's a causal relationship. There's even a letter from a NOAA Fisheries employee, Sean Hayes, dated from May 2022, about this. I'll go into this when we're debunking his claims. But he had the gall to write essentially that Landman is propagandizing for the oil and gas industry. I think it's actually a read into the vibe shift that is going on. A lot of people see that climate policies don't work. They actually invite more environmental problems. Case in point, the wildfires raging in Southern California right now. You can blanket statement put and say, I'm fighting the climate crisis, I'm fighting climate change, and there's more money pumped into the problem, doesn't ameliorate the problem, so to speak. Well-intentioned policies don't lead to great outcomes environmentally, economically, socially speaking. We are seeing that, again, playing live right now in Los Angeles. But more importantly, picking on the oil and gas industry is always a very convenient thing for people like Sammy Roth to do. He's paid to do this, and it's really funny that he's claiming that they're engaging in propaganda. So I essentially write at Substack, which is very important for context here, that this guy has a history of endorsing bad policies, which are not environmentally friendly. You will remember, I think I talked about his column endorsing essentially the potential littering of 20 to 30 million acres of Bureau of Land Management lands out west under Biden's proposed, hopefully soon to be revoked, Western Solar Plan. He said, we have to do this because the climate crisis, fighting the climate crisis warrants it. Anyone who thinks about the trade-offs to clean energy projects would find that to be a very boneheaded, impractical solution. You don't have to do that because those panels don't even harness enough energy. He criticized incoming Interior Secretary Doug Burgum of, quote, wanting to intentionally destroy the climate with the National Energy Council, what his plans are to unleash more domestic energy offshore and onshore. And now, of course, he's calling Landman a gusher of oil and gas propaganda. But why would a show about oil and gas want to portray those people negatively? I think Taylor Sheridan doesn't want to be like everyone else in Hollywood. You have those various different shows and movies, rather. Deepwater Horizon. You have that documentary Gasland, which is terrible. You also have that movie with Matt Damon I spoke about here that showed that somehow this natural gas worker industry person saw the light on fracking and then eventually came to reconsider his position with working with a fracking company. Fracking is maligned. Oil and gas is maligned very heavily. It was in the past. I think now the tide is changing where people see that you need these processes. They're very efficient. They're clean. They abide by all environmental standards. And you're going to need this reliable energy in this increasingly demanding age of electricity and grid demands, where we're going to need reliable energy, and solar and wind will not cut it. The capacity factors of both of them are abysmally pathetic. 25% for solar, it only works 25% of the year. Wind, if you're lucky, onshore, 35% of the year. Nuclear is about 93% of the year. Geothermal is about 90%. Oil and gas is quite a bit of improvement of solar and wind. And a lot of people are now realizing that the power plant rule of the Biden administration is going to have deleterious consequences for this rising electricity demand because you don't have these replacements. These are not even adequate supplements. What he said, essentially, lithium mines can in fact cause environmental damage. It's not anywhere near as bad as heat waves, fires, floods of the climate crisis. Cows are indeed major sources of heat trapping carbon emissions. Not that there's any chance that we'll get rid of all the cattle. And yes, solar and wind farms can harm birds, although not nearly as much as global warming, which is why the National Audubon Society supports such projects. As far as offshore wind farms killing whales, it's an absurd lie spread by President-elect Trump and other fossil fuel supporters, despite being repeatedly debunked. And then he adds, these are just a few of the misleading claims sprinkled throughout Landman. They're emblematic of the show's biggest flaw. As entertaining as it can be when Sheridan focuses on the riveting characters, he can't stop getting in his own way with propaganda that serves to lionize the oil industry. Now, lithium mines, briefly, in my Substack, gonna condense it for you here. Earth.org says of lithium mining, though emissions deriving from mining two critical elements are lower than those deriving from fossil fuel production, the extraction methods for lithium and cobalt, can be very energy intensive, leading to air and water pollution, land degradation, and potential for groundwater contamination. A paradox, therefore, can arise between clean revolution and dirty lithium mines. It is true that electrifying cars and other aspects of society favors the reduction of carbon emissions. However, after we consider the cost of emissions associated with extracting lithium, the transition may not be as efficient as we believe, especially when miners are not using clean energy. This is the paradox of lithium from the Columbia Climate School, dated January 18th, 2023. Solar and wind. Not as intensive, not as bad, more reliable than fossil fuels. Wrong. There are two pivotal charts I want to point your attention to about this. This is in my Substack. Department of Energy. I talked about capacity factor at which the technology works across 365 days. Nuclear is 93%. Geothermal, they say 74%. Natural gas, 56%. Hydropower, 42%. Coal, 40%. Wind, 35.4%. Solar, 24.9%. So wind and solar don't pass the smell test with respect to capacity factor. Again, they also are very weather dependent. You need the sun for solar, and you need wind for wind power. That's pretty self-explanatory. And even when you factor in government subsidies, these are not cheap technologies. They have to be routinely subsidized, and the infrastructure or the installation costs, the upfront costs rather, far outweigh whatever so-called measurable savings you're going to have with your electricity bill. Have you heard the astronomical cost of solar rooftop installations? Far outweigh the cost of what you would potentially be saving with your utility bill. Same with wind. And again, subsidies do not save these. They actually obscure and hide the true costs of these. Wind power is actually quite expensive without these so-called subsidies, still expensive with subsidies. And let's talk about their land footprint. I always love to hone in on this because people like Sammy Roth do not account what the environmental footprint of these projects are. This is done in the context, what I'm talking about, compared to nuclear energy, compared to solar and wind, and how much land is required. This is from the Visual Capitalist. They took some information from the Nuclear Energy Institute and Columbia University, who have talked about the environmental footprint of these so-called clean energy technologies. Nuclear has a very small environmental footprint, all things considered. It's about 1 square mile of land that is needed for a 1,000 gigawatt facility. The equivalent 1,000 gigawatt or 1 megawatt facility for solar and wind, how much land does that require? You need 360 times more land than nuclear to accommodate 431 utility scale wind turbines. What is the land capacity you need for solar? You need 3.1 million photovoltaic solar panels, which is about 75 times more land than nuclear requires for a single equivalent facility. Great chart that they have there. I mean, this is really hard to refute. You look at this comparison and you see how small of a footprint, let's say, nuclear reactors have versus utility scale wind, utility scale solar. It's no question that these are not clean or even environmentally friendly either. So they're not efficient, they're not clean, they require a lot of land. So why are we jumping on board this? I'm not personally jumping on board this. Why did this outgoing administration push this? Even some Republicans push this, which I think is wrong-headed of them to do too, which is why we're going to be returning, I think, to a state of supporting reliable energy, whether it's coal, oil, natural gas, and nuclear, geothermal. Proven reliables, not this highly subsidized, grifting project scheme that we see from net zero dictates with solar and wind. Those are going out of the question. President-elect Trump has said that offshore wind especially is not going to be in the picture across the next 4 years. Let me end briefly on this question of misinformation about offshore wind in Wales. I want to go back to this memo I alluded to from Sean Hayes of NOAA Fisheries. He writes, however, unlike vessel traffic and noise, which can be mitigated to some extent, oceanographic impacts from installed and operating turbines cannot be mitigated for the 30-year lifespan of the project. This is my commentary. If they live up to that, they don't work up to those 30 years. Back to his quote, unless they are decommissioned. Disturbance to right whale foraging could have population-level effects on an already endangered and stressed species. The right whale population is food resource limited and generally in poor body condition. The presence of structures such as wind turbines are likely to result in both local and broader oceanographic effects and may disrupt the dense aggregations and distribution of zooplankton prey through altering the strength of tidal currents and associated fronts, changes in stratification, primary production, the degree of mixing, and stratification in the water column. This is a legit scientist from the Biden administration who said this. Not me, making this out of thin air. So is Sammy Roth not cognizant of the science that shows that there is a negative impact of offshore wind? Or is he being paid out by his supporters? These climate columnists do get a lot of financial backing from these clean energy groups. They have to disclose it. It's pretty obvious there that they do. So why is he so reluctant to be honest and transparent about the shortcomings and trade-offs to wind and solar? Doesn't want to talk about it. It's an inconvenient truth, as Al Gore likes to say, but we can use those words against these people. But like I said, and always talk about, I'm not trying to be an apologist of the oil and gas industry, but you have to recognize that we depend and thrive off of so many oil and gas derivatives. You don't like it? Wean yourself off of it. The rest of us will happily continue to live a first world living standard made possible by fossil fuels, oil and gas in particular. But these people will never wean themselves off of oil and gas because it's impossible to do so. Everything we depend on is derived from it. From makeup to cars to microchips to appliances. So many things depend on oil and gas, and we would be worse off if we did not have oil and gas. So I'm going to say we need more so-called fossil fuel propaganda like Landman. It's more nuanced. It talks about the nuances of the oil and gas industry, the conversations people have. I love the monologues and diatribes from Billy Bob Thornton's character, Tommy Norris. It's a great show. Season 1 concluded. If you haven't watched it yet, I highly recommend it. Get the Paramount Plus subscription. I'm not told to say that by any means, but it's worth the subscription. Great program, and I hope there is season 2. If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.